Mysterious disappearance on the highway.
Chapter 1. Family Travel. It was a cold winter day in early January 2024. The Walker's family, Michael, his wife Sarah, and their 7-year-old daughter Emily, were heading out for a long-awaited trip to a small town known for its cozy ski resorts and picturesque landscapes. Michael, a successful architect, rarely had time for his family due to his busy work schedule, so this trip was supposed to be an opportunity for them to relax and spend time together. Emily was excited about the upcoming adventure. She sat in the back seat of the car, covered with a warm blanket, holding her favorite plush toy, a bear named Teddy. Sarah, a caring mother, looked at her daughter with love and tenderness. They drove for several hours, enjoying conversations and musical hits, when suddenly the sky began to cloud over and the first snowflakes began to appear on the road. Sarah noticed that Michael looked tense. "Is everything okay?" she asked, touching his hand. "Yeah, it's just the weather getting worse," he replied, glancing quickly at the sky. "The road might get slippery." Emily, engrossed in playing with Teddy, didn't pay attention to her parents' conversation. Soon a snowstorm began, and visibility on the road deteriorated sharply. Thick snow covered everything around, hiding the road and making it dangerously narrow. Michael slowed down and began driving more carefully, trying not to lose sight of the rare road signs. Chapter 2. The Uninvited Passenger. After driving a few more kilometers through the endless whiteness, they noticed an old gas station standing alone on the side of the road. The thought flashed through their mind that it would be nice to stop and take a short break. At the same time, they could fill up with gas, drink some hot coffee, and let Emily stretch her legs. Michael pulled into a gas station and parked the car near an abandoned-looking building. As soon as the engine died, a chilling howl of wind could be heard all around, like someone screaming in the distance. "It's kind of creepy in here," Sarah said, looking around. "Do you think we should stop here?" "We need to rest a little," Michael answered, opening the door. "Let's stay for a couple of minutes and then we'll move on." They stepped out of the car and the cold air hit them immediately. Emily clutched her mother's hand tightly, her eyes widening as she took in the dark windows of the gas station. Not a single light inside, not a sound of life. Everything seemed frozen in time. Michael went to the old fuel pump but found it was not working. Suddenly he felt a strange sensation as if someone was watching them closely. He looked around, but saw no one. "There's no one here," he said, returning to the car. "Maybe we should keep going." Sarah nodded in agreement and they decided to continue their journey. As they were getting into the car, Emily suddenly froze and whispered, "Mom, I saw someone in the window." Sarah winced and looked at the old building. It was still silent and empty, no signs of life. "You must be mistaken, dear," she reassured her daughter. "There's no one here." But something in Emily's voice made her heart beat faster. The girl looked scared, and her words echoed in Sarah's head. Chapter 3. The Unexplained. They were back on the road, but the tension was still there. The snow was getting heavier, the road was becoming less visible, and every minute felt like an hour. Sarah decided to text her friends to let them know where they were and that everything was okay. As Sarah pulled her phone out of her bag, she noticed that the mobile signal was weak. She typed a message. "We are on the highway. The weather is bad. We feel like someone is following us, but it's probably just nerves. Keep us informed if anything happens." But the message failed to be sent. The network was completely lost. At that moment, their car was suddenly enveloped in darkness and the headlights began to flicker. Michael pressed the brakes, trying to stop, but the car continued to move, as if it was on a slippery surface. "What is this?" he breathed out, trying to control the machine. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a silhouette appeared in front of them, and Michael swerved the wheel, trying to avoid a collision. The car screeched, spun, and finally stopped on the side of the road. Everyone froze, realizing what had just happened. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Michael was silent, trying to catch his breath. He looked cautiously into the rearview mirror, expecting to see something terrible there. But behind him there was only darkness, behind which hid a silent and cold world. "We must leave here," he said finally. "Immediately." But the car wouldn't start. Every time Michael tried to turn the key, the engine made only a faint sound, as if it had refused to work. They were trapped far from civilization in the heart of a raging snowstorm. Chapter 4. An Eerie Find. Michael and Sarah began to panic. Emily was quietly sobbing in the back seat, hugging her teddy bear. Desperately, Michael opened the door and stepped outside, hoping to check what had happened to the car. But as soon as he stepped out, the door slammed shut, leaving him outside alone in the silent desert. He looked around the car but didn't see anything suspicious. Everything seemed fine except the engine wouldn't start. Suddenly he felt something touch his shoulder. He turned around sharply but saw only emptiness. Meanwhile, Sarah, sitting in her car, noticed that her phone screen lit up. At first, she thought it was just a notification, but then she realized that the camera had turned on. The screen showed what she had filmed a few minutes earlier, Michael getting out of the car. However, when she looked closely, she saw something strange. A shadow appeared behind Michael in the frame, similar to a human silhouette, but clearly not human in size and shape. This creature did not move, but its presence was felt even through the screen. Sarah froze in horror, not knowing what to do. She wanted to shout at Michael to get back in the car, but she couldn't make a sound. Michael, noticing that Sarah was acting strangely, headed back to the car. But as soon as he took a step, everything around him became darker. The snowstorm seemed to envelop him, hiding even the light of the headlights from him. It seemed to him that he was walking, but at the same time he was staying in the same place. He turned around, trying to find the car, but saw only endless emptiness. Chapter 5. Trapped in Horror. Inside the car, Sarah watched in horror as Michael slowly disappeared into the snowstorm, seemingly dissolving into it. She tried to call out to him, but the words caught in her throat. She felt fear grip her, making every second seem like an eternity. Emily, noticing that her mother was scared, also began to panic. "Mom, what's going on? Where's Dad?" Sarah didn't know what to say. She hugged her daughter, trying to hide her fear, but the girl felt that something was wrong. Michael, meanwhile, was wandering along the deserted road trying to find the car. It seemed to him that he was circling around the same place, but he could not stop. His strength was leaving him, and soon he felt his legs begin to treacherously give way. Suddenly, something strange appeared in front of him, an old wooden sign pointing away from the road. It said, "Turn to the old village." Below, in small print, was something he did not have time to read, because the sign quickly disappeared, as if it had never been there. Michael, in desperation, decided to follow this mysterious sign, hoping that it would lead him to salvation. But the further he went, the more he felt like he was sinking into some kind of nightmare.
Chapter 6. Disappearance. Sarah realized that Michael was missing. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt like she was going to pass out. Her phone rang again, but it was Michael's number, even though his phone was still in the car. Panicked, she answered, but all she heard was hissing and a faint, barely audible voice. "Ra." The voice was so weak that Sarah couldn't tell if it was really Michael. She tried to talk to him, shouting into the phone, but there was no answer. Then the connection was cut off and a notification appeared on the phone screen. Unidentified device connected. At that moment, she felt something cold touch her hand. She looked down and saw that her hand was covered in frost, although it was warm in the car. The fear reached its peak, and Sarah realized that they were trapped with no way out. She glanced at Emily, who was now crying and hugging her teddy bear. Sarah knew she had to act, but her body felt frozen with terror. The only thing she could do was hold her daughter and hope that this was all just a bad dream. Chapter 7. The Last Entry. Meanwhile, Sarah received a new message on her phone. She opened it and saw a short video taken from Michael's camera. The video was not of the road they were driving on, but of something else entirely. It showed an abandoned, ruined building with dark lights glowing inside. Then the camera swung around and the same silhouette she had seen earlier appeared on the screen. He was much closer now, looking straight into the camera. The video cut off, but Sarah continued to stare at the screen, unable to look away. She realized that this message was the last thing Michael had managed to send. The snowfall outside began to ease, and the moonlight fell on the road. Sarah looked out the window, hoping to see some sign of life, but all she saw was an empty road. She decided she had to get out of the car and find help. "Emily, stay here," she whispered, stroking her daughter's head. "I'll be back soon." But when she opened the car door, a cold wind blew in and the headlights flickered again. Suddenly, in front of her, a few meters from the car, she saw the same creature from the video. It was slowly approaching, its eyes glowing yellow in the darkness. Sarah froze, unable to move. Her body was frozen with terror, and her feet seemed rooted to the ground. The creature continued to approach, and she knew this was the end. The last thing she heard was Emily screaming her name before everything went dark. Since then, the Walker's family has never been found. The car was found a few days later, but it was empty. The only thing left was a phone with the last video and faint footprints in the snow that led nowhere. To this day, the disappearance remains one of the most mysterious and terrifying stories, whispered in police reports and horror stories across the country. Ghost in the Old House. In the small, secluded town of La Moraine in the south of France, hidden among the hills and vineyards, stood an ancient house that had always inspired fear and trepidation in the locals. Its dark reputation did not develop overnight, but over the centuries, when mysterious and often tragic events took place there. The house was built in the early 18th century by the Dupuis family, a wealthy and influential family. It was built in the style typical of the time: massive stone walls, high ceilings with wooden beams and large windows overlooking a picturesque garden. The house was surrounded by a high stone wall, behind which grew old oak and chestnut trees. Inside, the house was decorated with expensive fabrics, antique furniture, and paintings, which mostly depicted hunting scenes and family portraits. The Dupuis family lived here for generations, but their history was full of tragedy. Many family members died under mysterious circumstances, and with each new generation, rumors of a curse became more and more eerie. The last owner of the house was a young and beautiful woman named Elizabeth Dupuis. Her life ended tragically at the age of 23, and since then, according to locals, her spirit could not find peace. Elizabeth was engaged to a young aristocrat from a neighboring town. The wedding was to be an important event for which all the inhabitants of La Moraine were preparing. The bride was known for her kindness and nobility. She was loved and respected, but the night before the wedding, Elizabeth disappeared without a trace. They searched for her everywhere, but found her only the next morning, dead, lying on the bed in her bedroom. The cause of death remained unknown, although many said that she was killed by her fiancé, who mysteriously disappeared from the city immediately after the tragedy. After her death, the house was empty. Relatives refused the inheritance, and the house remained standing, slowly crumbling under the influence of time. Local residents avoided it, afraid to even look at the gloomy building. They said that sounds could be heard from the house at night: whispers, footsteps, quiet moans. Sometimes in the windows you could see the silhouette of a woman who looked just like Elizabeth on the day of her death. Several decades passed, and the house gradually fell into oblivion, becoming part of urban legends. But in early 2024, a young and ambitious entrepreneur, Antoine LeBlanc, decided to buy the house and turn it into a luxury guest house. Antoine was a native of Paris, but decided to move to Provence to start a new life and open his own business in the tourism industry. He did not believe in ghosts and curses, considering them just part of the local folklore. When Antoine first saw the house, he was struck by its grandeur and historical significance. The house needed serious restoration, but it still had an old-world feel. Antoine imagined guests enjoying dinner on the terrace overlooking the garden, wandering through the ancient hallways and admiring the antiques. Restoration work began immediately after the purchase. Antoine hired a team of workers and architects to restore the house to its original appearance, while preserving all of its historical elements. The first few weeks passed without incident. Workers cleared the area, reinforced the walls, and began to restore the roof. However, strange things soon began to happen. One of the workers, an elderly man named Pierre, told Antoine that one evening when he stayed on the site later than usual, he heard whispers coming from the empty rooms. Pierre claimed that the whispers sounded like someone calling his name. Antoine was skeptical, thinking that the old man was simply tired and his imagination was playing tricks on him. However, when other workers began reporting similar incidents, Antoine began to wonder.
With each passing day, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Workers heard footsteps on the second floor, although no one was there. Tools disappeared and then turned up in the most unexpected places. One of the workers, a young guy named Jean, left the project after he felt an invisible hand touch his shoulder. Antoine tried to remain calm and confident that all this could be explained rationally, but the internal tension was growing. One night, Antoine decided to stay in the house alone to see for himself that all these stories were just a figment of his employees' imagination. He settled in one of the bedrooms on the first floor, trying to ignore the gloomy atmosphere around him. The house was quiet, only the occasional creak of the old floorboards could be heard when he moved around the room. Antoine tried to sleep, but his sleep was fitful and restless. Suddenly he woke up with the feeling that someone was watching him. He opened his eyes and saw a figure of a woman standing in the corner of the room. She was dressed in an old white dress, her face was pale and lifeless, and her eyes were empty. Antoine froze, unable to move. The woman looked at him silently, and in her eyes he could read sadness and suffering. Suddenly she disappeared, leaving behind a cold feeling of horror. Antoine jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, but it was locked. He tried desperately to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. At that moment, he heard the whispers again, right behind him. The whispers grew louder, turning into barely audible words. Antoine felt panic seize him. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Antoine, without thinking, ran out of the house, leaving everything behind. The next day he returned, but his resolve was shaken. He could not get the image of the woman he had seen that night out of his mind. Antoine decided to ask the locals to find out more about the house and its history. He went to an old tavern in the center of town where the locals often gathered. There he met an old woman named Madame Lefebvre, who knew all the legends and stories of the town. Madame Lefebvre told him about the tragic fate of Elizabeth Dupois, the last owner of the house. She was beautiful and young, but her life ended suddenly and under mysterious circumstances. People said that her spirit could not find peace and wandered the corridors of the house, guarding it from uninvited guests. Antoine was shocked by this story, but still hoped that he would be able to complete the project. He decided to return to the house and continue the restoration, but things got even worse. At night, Antoine heard whispers and footsteps coming from empty rooms. In one of the bedrooms, he found an old inscription on the wall that read, "Leave while you live." Antoine tried to erase it, but the inscription reappeared each time. Workers left the project one by one, leaving him alone. Antoine began to lose sleep and appetite. He felt the house was consuming him, taking away his strength and his mind. One night he saw Elizabeth's ghost again. She stood before him, her face twisted with pain and despair. She reached out to him and said, "You shouldn't have come back." Antoine felt terror wash over him and knew he had to leave this place. He tried to sell the house, but no one wanted to buy it. The locals were afraid to even approach it. Antoine realized that the curse of Dupois had sucked him in, and he would not be able to get rid of the house. He left everything and moved away. leaving the house empty and abandoned. Since then, the house has stood, surrounded by dark rumors and legends. Locals still avoid it, afraid of encountering Elizabeth's spirit. And Antoine, having returned to Paris, never spoke of his experience again. But at night, when everything around him is quiet, he sometimes hears a whisper coming from the darkness, reminding him of what he experienced in this house. Fordo.
Calls from the other world.
The story begins in a small town where life flowed measuredly and almost sleepily. Residents knew each other, discussed the latest news, and spent weekends with family. Everything was predictable until strange events began, connected with phone calls that seemed to come from nowhere. The main character of this story is Alexander Petrov, a man of about 40 years old, working as a manager in a small company. His life was seemingly stable, a good job, a cozy home, close friends. But one event turned his life upside down. One evening, when Alexander returned home after a long day at work, he heard his phone ring. It was an old desk phone that he kept more out of nostalgia than necessity. He mostly used his mobile, but sometimes he answered his landline, especially if it was an elderly relative calling. The call lasted a long time, although usually no one called this number at such a late hour. A little surprised, Alexander picked up the receiver and, expecting to hear a familiar voice, said the usual, "Hello." However, in response, he heard only silence. He repeated his question, but the silence remained, only occasionally interrupted by a faint noise, as if someone was on the other end but not speaking. Alexander was about to hang up when he suddenly heard a quiet, barely audible voice. It sounded muffled and distant, as if it was speaking from far away, through noise or interference. The voice said his name, but so indistinctly that Alexander could barely understand it. He tried to find out who it was, but the voice only repeated his name several times. Then the connection was cut off. This incident excited Alexander, but he wrote it off as some technical problems or a prank. However, the next day, the story repeated itself. At the same hour, the phone rang again, and Alexander again heard the same mysterious voice calling him by name. This time, the voice sounded a little more distinctly, and Alexander felt a strange excitement. It seemed to him that the voice was familiar, but he could not say for sure who it belonged to. These calls began to repeat themselves every night. At first, the voice simply said Alexander's name, but soon it began to speak more coherently. The voice spoke of things that only Alexander and his late friend Igor, who had died in a car accident several years earlier, knew. This was the same friend with whom Alexander had been especially close in his youth. They often spent time together, discussed life, shared secrets. With each new call, the voice became more confident and louder. One night, the voice spoke of an accident that happened many years ago when he and Igor went on a trip to the mountains. Then they almost died, finding themselves in a dangerous situation due to a rockfall. No one except Igor and Alexander knew about what happened that night. It was their secret. Alexander began to feel more and more uneasy. He didn't know what to think. Either someone had decided to play a prank on him by learning these secrets, or it was really something inexplicable. He was tormented by doubts, and he decided to figure out what was happening.
He began to investigate various hypotheses, from a technical glitch to the possibility of some unusual phenomenon. He asked a friend, an electronics specialist, to check the telephone line for possible interference or malfunctions. However, no abnormalities were found. The line was fine, and calls continued to come in. During one of the phone calls, the voice began to say more specific things. It began to remember the places that Alexander and Igor visited in their youth. One day, the voice mentioned an old house where they often met with friends. This house stood on the outskirts of the city, abandoned and half-ruined. Once upon a time, it was their favorite place where they came to talk, laugh, discuss the future. At that moment, Alexander realized that the voice really belonged to Igor. It was unthinkable, but he felt it was true. Memories of the past began to come alive, bringing to light forgotten moments of their friendship. Alexander remembered how they made plans for the future together, how they dreamed of great things. But all this was cut short on that fateful night when Igor died. The calls became more frequent and intrusive. Igor's voice began to tell about things that Alexander no longer remembered. These were small details of their communication, some events that seemed to have disappeared from his memory forever. Alexander felt that Igor was trying to tell him something, but he could not understand what exactly. One night, a voice said that their story was not over and that Igor needed Alexander's help. The voice asked him to come to the same abandoned house where they once spent time. Alexander was shocked. He could not believe that all this was really happening, but he decided to follow the instructions, despite his fear and doubts. The next evening, Alexander went to that very house. The place was even more gloomy and abandoned than he remembered. The wind whistled in the cracks of the old boards. The house seemed like a living creature, watching his every step. Alexander went inside and felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Everything was as in his memories, but at the same time somehow alien and unfamiliar. He walked through the dusty corridor and entered the room where he and Igor had once gathered. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was the same old landline phone that he had taken with him for some reason. Alexander picked it up and heard Igor's voice say, "I'm waiting for you. We have to finish what we started." Alexander looked around the room and his gaze fell on an old, long-forgotten chest in the corner. He didn't remember this chest being there before, but something drew him to it. Alexander walked over and opened the chest. Inside were old photographs, letters, and various objects that he and Igor had collected during those years. All of this was part of their youth, which they had once loved and cherished. But among all these things, Alexander found one special thing, an old cassette with the inscription, "For Sasha." He knew that there must be something important on this cassette because Igor often recorded his thoughts and ideas on a tape recorder. Having difficulty finding a suitable tape recorder in his house, Alexander turned on the cassette. On the recording was Igor's voice, saying that he felt the end was approaching. He talked about his fears, that he had a premonition that he would soon pass away. But in the end, Igor said that if something happened, he would try to contact Alexander to finish something important. He mentioned that there was one secret that he had not yet managed to reveal, and this secret was connected with their last journey together. After listening to the recording, Alexander felt his heart squeeze in his chest. It was too strange and scary. He understood that Igor had probably tried to tell him something important before his death, but had not had time. After listening to the tape, the calls stopped for a few days, and Alexander began to think that everything was finally over. But one night, the phone rang again. This time, Igor's voice was more insistent and demanding. He said that Alexander had to find one thing that would help complete their story. Igor pointed to the place where they had been during their last journey, the very gorge where they had almost died. Alexander realized that he had to return there to find what Igor was trying to tell him. Despite his fear, he decided to go to this place, hoping that he could finally